Welcome to this webinar. My name's Sally Haynes. I'm the Chief Executive of CIEEM, and I'm very pleased to welcome on the webinar with me today Julia Baker, Dr. Julia Baker, who's Biodiversity Technical Specialist at Balfour Beatty, Professor E.J. Milner-Gulland, who's the Tasso Leventis Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford. He's also Director of the Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science. Dr. Joseph Bull, who's Senior Lecturer at the Dahl Institute of Conservation and Ecology. Kerry Ten Carter, who's the Non-Exec Board Member for Natural England, but was formerly a Director of Forest Trends. He's also an RSPB Council member as well. And we're assisted today by Isabel Taylor, who's the Environmental Researcher at the University of Oxford. So, as I say, welcome to everybody to this very important webinar, I think, which really sets out the start of a very interesting scoping project. To take part in the webinar, or to ask questions, I should say, for the webinar, if you're familiar with Zoom, you'll know that at the bottom of the screen, you've got a toolbar, and one of those toolbars says Q&A. If you click on Q&A and type in your question, then we'll be able to collate all those, and at the end of the presentation, we'll go through as many of those questions as we can ask in the time available to us. So at any point during the presentations, please type your question in that Q&A box. You've also got a chat function. Please feel free to use that to comment or reply to another participant's comment, but please don't use that to ask a question. We'll only be focusing on the Q&A box for the questions. Right, so about this project. So in 2016, CIEEM, together with Syria and IEMA, published the Good Practice Principles for Biodiversity Net Gain in Development. These were UK-wide principles, which are drawn on international principles for biodiversity net gain and biodiversity offsetting. And the idea of these principles were to try and set the sort of the ground rules, the benchmark of good practice, what biodiversity net gain in the UK would look like. And as you'll see from the list there on the screen, these were really important key principles to underpin good biodiversity net gain. Those principles led to the development of some good practice guidance, some delivery guidance, which was published in early 2019. But they also, I'm pleased to say, helped to underpin the emerging policy and legislation in relation to biodiversity net gain. So, for example, within the Environment Bill, which incorporates biodiversity net gain as a mandatory requirement of much of development in England, that policy, that legislation is being underpinned by the biodiversity net gain principles. We did make a commitment when we published these in 2016 to review and update the principles after 3 years or so. So are they still relevant? Are they still appropriate? Do they go far enough, especially in relation to sustainable development? Or can we be more ambitious as we learn and develop our approach to biodiversity net gain? So that review is ongoing, but also emerging out of that review has been some further thinking around the importance of the well-being aspect of biodiversity net gain and ensuring that people are able to maintain or enhance that connection to nature. So this webinar and the online survey that will be launched hopefully later this week are part of a scoping study from CIEEM in collaboration with Balfour Beatty and the University of Oxford, and which is being funded by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And that scoping study is designed to look at how well the well-being aspects of biodiversity net gain are incorporated into the current approaches, and whether there's a need for further guidance, tools, etc., that would help ensure that it doesn't get inadvertently overlooked. Over to you, please, Julia.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So the People and Nature survey has been going for a number of years now, and it continued to collect data throughout lockdown under COVID-19, and the period April to June 2020 showed quite a few interesting findings. The highest numbers of people are spending time outdoors, that urban green spaces are certainly the most popular green space. And actually that's a trend that we've seen before. People, if they go to nature, tend to want to go to somewhere very local. But it reminds us of just how important people's local access to nature is. But also, even more so, 85% of people surveyed said that being in nature makes them happy. And, you know, you kind of read the statistic and you know that, you know, we don't need the data to know that, but what it does do is it reminds us of the importance of people's connection with nature. So whenever we work with nature, and particularly under net gain, I think it's a fundamental that we listen to the surveys and the other science that points to people's well-being and how it's related to nature. But also, even more importantly, with this type of survey, they highlighted the social inequalities that if you live in highly deprived areas, you are less likely to spend time in nature. And the survey goes on to talk about the possible influences on people's well-being from that. So we have the evidence. This is just one example, and even more so under lockdown, under COVID-19, I think it's the reminder of the importance of giving people access to nature and the influence that has on people's well-being. But let's come back to Sally's point about our good practice principles. So 2016 that these were published. What does good look like when we work with biodiversity net gain here in the UK? And there's a couple of places that the people aspects of biodiversity net gain really come out. It's in principle 3, it talks about sharing benefits fairly with stakeholders, but I'd like to just touch on principle 5, make a measurable net gain contribution. And that is to achieve a measurable overall gain for biodiversity and the services ecosystems provide, while directly contributing towards nature conservation priorities. So right from the start, you know, our good practice for biodiversity net gain has recognized that this isn't just about biodiversity. We're not thinking in silos here. We're taking a holistic approach, a comprehensive approach. And we're recognizing that this is about biodiversity, but it's also about people's connection with nature. And it's phrased back in 2016, the phrase was the services that ecosystems provide. Now, when I talk about this, people say, "Oh, does that mean we do an ecosystem service assessment?" And I think it's important to note that the principles don't tell us the how. That's now our job. They provide that aspiration, the ambition that Sally was talking about, and it's our job now in industry to make that work. You know, they provide the direction of travel. So practically, how, and we've worked, you know, quite well in terms of the biodiversity aspects, but it is now thinking about this wider aspect. But it's the point that since these principles were published, people's connections with nature have been so much a fundamental part of our biodiversity net gain approach. And we're making good progress with the biodiversity aspect, and, you know, incredible strides within the last 4 to 5 years. And now we are getting to the stage when, as Sally mentioned, it's really underpinning the mandatory approach here in England. But the but is we've given less attention to the social aspects. So I think as part of this review, as part of thinking about these good practice principles, are they enough? Are they in the right direction? What can we do? It's now to think about these social aspects and really take them on board. The one thing, though, that here in the UK, we've certainly not been alone with that. While we're making good progress on the biodiversity aspects and giving less attention, that's a situation that's been mirrored internationally. And Jo, to ask your thoughts on this. So thinking about the international scene, what have the discussions been about the social aspects of biodiversity net gain, and where are they now?
Thanks, Julia. Thanks everyone for coming along. Nice to be here with you all. So yeah, it's a good question. And to answer it, really start by turning to kind of some of the sources for international best practice when it comes to biodiversity impact mitigation and no net loss and net gain policies. And really a lot of the kind of international best practice guidance can be drawn back to a couple of organizations, particularly BBOP and the IFC. So I'm sure many people on this call will know BBOP, the Business of Biodiversity Offsets Program, who developed a lot of the good practice guidance on biodiversity impact mitigation and no net loss or net gain. And they really started to publish on this topic of social considerations in no net loss and net gain back in about 2009, some of the guidance they were publishing there. And this was developed further alongside the International Finance Corporation, which again, I'm sure many will be familiar with, or at least some will, who published much on this topic back in, up through to 2012. So that research, that community of practice from BBOP and the IFC really developed a lot of the thinking around how to, or the fact that we should be considering social issues when designing these kind of no net loss or net gain approaches. Now, despite that best practice, despite those ideas coming into best practice, and despite the fact there's lots of regulatory and policy drivers in different places worldwide, different jurisdictions worldwide, that require some kind of consideration of the social outcomes from no net loss or net gain, they remain poorly accounted for in these kinds of projects. And that's something we know from the research, right? So there's been a fair amount of scientific research into the implementation of no net loss or net gain, where we've kind of found that social outcomes are often poorly accounted for. And that includes research all over the world, but I mean, particularly there have been interesting studies in places like Uganda, in Madagascar. There's been a fair amount of work in the UK as well, actually. So that's it's one of the things that we know is still relatively poorly treated in practice, unfortunately. And another issue is that, when it comes to no net loss or net gain type interventions, when it comes to biodiversity offsetting, for example, that often is designed quite late on in the kind of project development process, such that even if social considerations have been built in earlier on through, through environmental and social impact assessment, it might be that by the time it gets around to developing, again, for example, the biodiversity offset strategy, it's quite late in the process to actually properly align with the social aspects that have been considered elsewhere. So that's the kind of things that we touched upon in our kind of 2018, the international good practice principles, guiding principles, which are kind of on the slide there in front of you, and as mentioned by Sally and by Julia. And really that was aligned with the process going on for CIEEM and the discussion around good practice principles there. And just worth making clear that this document, giving some guiding principles for how to incorporate the consideration of people into the net loss and net gain, is based on extensive consultation. It's not only written by a group who have carried out extensive research and kind of practice into these kind of projects, but it's also based on extensive consultation with other groups and with not only practitioners, researchers, also policymakers. So that's the basis for this, really. And the idea with these principles is that they seek to set out a clear outcome for biodiversity no net loss or net gain. And that's, as it's kind of up on the screen in front of you there, that these projects should be designed and implemented in a way that safeguards people's well-being as a minimum, so that their kind of well-being, they perceive their well-being to be at least as good as a result of the development projects, no net loss or net gain activities. So the principles are quite high level. I mean, if you actually read through the document, they're quite high level. But it's, they do encapsulate some quite important decisions that we made on the basis of this extensive consultation about how to do this kind of thing. For example, as Julia says, considering people's well-being, which, is something that can be defined quite precisely within the scientific literature as the thing we're measuring. And also, for example, decisions around safeguarding people's well-being. The idea that we shouldn't be allowing a dip in people's well-being as part of projects that then is compensated for later, that we really should be safeguarding people's well-being as part of these projects. So again, though these principles are a relatively high level and they're meant to be guiding principles, at the same time they build upon this wealth of best practice research and policy making on this topic, and they encapsulate some quite important decisions about how we might proceed with incorporating social considerations.
And Joe, this is quite a strong point it's making. I mean, I've just shown a kind of snip from the principles here, and it goes through measurement. Okay, so social outcomes and biodiversity, no net loss and net gain are measured in terms of well-being. I mean, that's not going to be the job of the ecologist. So how were these principles devised in terms of, well, who does what?
Yeah, and it's a good question. And obviously, a lot of the document talks about the need for collaboration, right? Really, collaboration between specialists is key here, because we recognise that on a lot of projects, certainly the bigger projects, we have expert ecologists working on and it's not necessarily the ecologist's job, as you say, to consider social outcomes. But then we also have a lot of social specialists, and in a lot of cases, the social specialists, maybe a larger team than the ecology team. So there's a lot of work going on both the ecological and the social impacts of these projects. The key thing really is ensuring collaboration between the specialists working on those different areas. So that's one of the focal points for the principles, is for this is collaboration at the right point in the project lifetime to ensure that social considerations are incorporated into net loss or net gain design. I think also part of it is really trying to find a way to provide the tools and the language really for ecologists to work with the social specialists as they design these net loss and net gain strategies to be able to consider social outcomes, even if it's not the ecologist's job to actually evaluate well-being, for example.
Yeah, and it can certainly raise the bar and have that. And we know that, okay, that collaboration sounds nice, but does it work in practice, and where do we go from there? And I think we're going to come on to those, maybe the opportunities there, but also the challenges. So just taking that and thinking very specifically about what this might mean in terms of if the UK, we've always learned from the international community, we've always learned from their experience, and now it's a question of, well, the international community is calling for biodiversity, consider well-being. And I think it's worth just taking a moment to be very clear about this. So it's well-being associated with biodiversity, it's people's connections with nature, that's what we're talking about here. And it's the impacts on well-being specifically from losses and gains in nature. And as Joe mentioned, I think one of the most important points is this is about net gain. This is about net gains for biodiversity, but let's do that in ways that safeguard as a minimum people's well-being, and where possible, enhance well-being. So that's a very specific scope that we are discussing here. So I suppose the big question is then the international principles call for net gain to assess and measure well-being. So EJ, can we ask your advice then? What is well-being, and how do we measure it?
Thanks, Julia. So yeah, I'm just going to give a really quick kind of overview of what well-being means. As it's seen as a bit of a jargon term, and it's something that can be quite hard to get your head around. And the first thing I guess to say is that well-being isn't about money, it's about a good life, so a positive physical, social and mental state. And that's easy to say, but saying it doesn't help you to measure it. The work that we've been doing adapted some work from the World Bank and another study that was funded by the UK government, and defines well-being along 3 axes, and focuses very much on the fact that people's well-being is to do with their place in society. So the first one is the one that's a bit more obvious, a bit more easy to measure, that we might understand more clearly, which is what you have, so material well-being. The other part of well-being is the relational part, which is what you can do with what you have. So how can you use the assets that you have to live the good life that you want? And the final one is the one that people maybe think about more obviously when they think about the well-being, which is what you feel about what you have and what you can do. So subjective well-being. And David Byrne puts that very nicely in his Talking Head song. So those are the 3 aspects of well-being. And that means that well-being is both individual, it's dynamic, it's multidimensional. So something that's clearly quite challenging. And also that means that it needs to be measured in ways that enable people to express how they feel about things. So it needs to be measured in a way that's tailored to the local situation, and that is that speaks to the people whose well-being is being measured. And that means that you can have quantitative aspects like material well-being, but you also have to have these qualitative aspects that tap more into those feelings that can't be expressed in units. So based on those studies that we've been doing, these are some examples of the kinds of indicators that you can develop for these 3 different dimensions. And you can see that although these are ones that were developed for developing countries, so things like meals skipped, so food security and things like that, educational opportunities, but then also things around people's participation in decision making and sense of agency, and then finally your kind of trust in external actors and ability to pursue goals. Again, you might feel that those are a bit airy-fairy, but we can actually map a lot of the indicators that the Office for National Statistics use for wellbeing into this same framework. So these are just a few of the wellbeing indicators that the UK government uses in the ONS surveys, mapped into that same framework. So how does that then map down to net gain on a project level? Some of the indicators that I just showed you work quite well, but some of them aren't really very useful for people who might actually be trying to have net gain and improvement in wellbeing in a project. Some of those indicators are individual, some are regional, some are national, so it can be hard to relate it to specific development. None of the indicators in the ONS study are qualitative, so they don't capture that feeling of subjective wellbeing. And then some of them are quite indirect, not very clearly related to individual wellbeing or happen at the wrong scale, and I've just put a couple of examples in there. So I think at the moment the UK's wellbeing indicators are trying to be doing too many things at the same time, and therefore confounding social wellbeing with national level public policy goals. And so that means that we need to have tailoring to the local context through a participatory process for a given development. I think the indicators aren't actually the challenge, though. Some of the complexities around actually measuring wellbeing for a project includes things like, where do you draw the line as to whose wellbeing counts? So how close do you have to be geographically, but also emotionally, to a development in order to have your wellbeing counted? Where do you draw the line geographically and in terms of affected groups? And then how do you know when wellbeing is changing anyway over time? How do you know whether you have achieved positive wellbeing change in your project or not? And where does your responsibility for people's wellbeing ends? And these are the kinds of the questions that get people concerned when they're told that they have to start measuring wellbeing for their projects. Just to give you a more concrete example, if you have an area which is not particularly great for biodiversity, but where people use it for dog walking or sports or whatever, and you turn it into something that would have a measurable biodiversity net gain and also social improvements, you're going to have a social gain from that development. And there'll be a biodiversity loss, and there'll also be some social loss. So your ESIA process measures that biodiversity loss and then measures the social loss, and then leads to compensation for the social loss and an offset for the biodiversity loss. So the space in which we're talking now is the fact that there are these kinds of interactions which aren't captured at the moment in ESIAs. So when you have a biodiversity offset, if that's offsite, that could potentially also cause social loss to people offsite. It might cause loss of access, for example, to an area as it's put forward to conservation. And the social compensation can then feed back to produce biodiversity loss. And so those kind of purple arrows are where we need to have some guidelines about how do you incorporate wellbeing into a project. Of course, we have trade-offs, and those trade-offs can't be avoided. But the point is to really understand who's winning and who's losing in a given development locally, and what kinds of winning and losing there is. So there can be some quite subtle losses. So for example, I've put here, older residents might actually lose a sense of agency or a sense of place by the fact that their area is changing. So the ideal is to have a baseline assessment in which you find out how people think they will feel under an intervention and design that intervention accordingly. As Joe said, it needs to be done a priori. Then you have this transition period as the intervention beds in and as other things in the system change. So people move in and out, a generation shift and aspirations change. But then you can have these assessments of true and changing intervention impact over the longer term in that broader context. In practice, metrics do exist. I've shown you some already. In practice, you don't have to do everybody everywhere, but but people will be aggregated into meaningful groups. People can be aggregated into groups of people for whom you can measure the well-being change at the group level, so you don't have to do every single person. The emphasis I'm putting on the qualitative is really important because you know, people's well-being can be badly affected if you don't have that feeling of equity, that procedural equity, distributive equity, and just the recognition of people's different points of view. And then you have to build ongoing monitoring of well-being into the design and a process for making change based upon changes in well-being. There is some guidance on evaluating well-being. This is some guidance that we wrote focused on developing country, but is also still relevant in the UK. And that's what I want to say. So I will put back to Julia. I hope that was useful.
So we know that the connections between nature and people and the influence that has on well-being have been part of our good practice approach here in the UK. And as we come to review and think about those principles, it's really looking at those social aspects. We know internationally there are calls for no net loss, net gain projects to measure the impacts on people's well-being, to safeguard them as a minimum, and ideally we will enhance them. We know that there's been great science advances in how we think and assess well-being, and EJ's just run through some actually very practical examples. As here, our own Office of National Statistics that EJ's mentioned. I mean, that well-being survey has been going on for a number of years now. There's no off-the-shelf package for us to do this right now, but we didn't have an off-the-shelf biodiversity metric by any means. So this is about the direction of travel. This is about thinking about the good practice for biodiversity net gain in the UK and thinking about where do we want that ambition to go to, where do we want to strive for. So what we're going to do now is set out some reasons why we could why well-being might be part of our good practice approach, but also challenges. And we'd like to ask you to vote on the ones that you think are going to be most important, and then we'll come back and we will discuss these. Now, these are only examples. So if you have any other drivers or reasons why, please put them in the Q&A, or if you want us to discuss them, or in the chat function. If you have any other challenges facing your work or any other challenges that you can think of that we don't talk about, again, please tell us, put them in the Q&A or in the chat function. So reasons why, and from speaking with various people about this, it seems to be that these are some of the reasons why the UK good practice approach to biodiversity net gain should incorporate well-being. So I'm going to run through these, and then we're going to ask you to vote on the ones that you think are most important. So as a starting point, it increases the likelihood of biodiversity net gain success. You know, quite simply, it's not a nice to have, it's actually a fundamental need if we're going to get successful net gain outcomes. And if you like, projects that reflect people's interests about nature are the most likely to deliver successful net gain outcomes. And we've just had a few interesting talks this morning actually about, well, thinking about net gain and giving access to people might bring about that local community ownership, which will then safeguard that site for the long term. So thinking about well-being, having biodiversity net gain, reflecting people's interests are most likely to deliver successful net gain outcomes. Maybe it's better decision making. Are we missing something here? Will well-being data, if we think about the impacts of biodiversity net gain on people's well-being, can that actually improve our decision making? And all the way through from investors, from planners to developers. So maybe it just leads to better quality decisions. There's possibly an aspect there about demonstrating the benefits. Everyone wants to have that claim, if you like, of biodiversity net gain. And what I love about net gain is that it's been industry owned right from the start. It started at the grassroots level. And is this another reason why that if we do this well and we achieve those well-being benefits, then developers can demonstrate that. There's the social license to operate, which I think is an important aspect to consider. If we're making these better decisions, if we're really using wellbeing data to design our net gain projects, will that reduce the risks of protests and objections from a purely, if you like, blunt business interface? All of that costs time and money, and is that a better way of going about our design and our delivery of these projects? But there's quite a fundamental aspects as well. We're coming out of COVID-19, the discussions around Build Back Better about the green recovery. You know, what does true sustainable development look like? And well-being is fast becoming, and is now so much, the cornerstone of sustainable development. So surely this should also apply to biodiversity net gain. So those are some examples of the reason why. And can we now run the poll to ask you to vote on the one that you think is most important? So I think the poll's come up. Please vote on the one that you think is the most important. And it looks like we have the results. So 48%, I'm hoping you can see this, but 48% are saying the most important reason is that this is actually genuinely true sustainable development. Biodiversity net gain, you know, I mean, this is for development to underpin a thriving environment. And if we're talking about that in terms of sustainable development, then it's that comprehensive take on that. 48% went for true sustainable development. So 34% voted for the long-term success of biodiversity net gain. 2% went for social license to operate, and 8% went for data for better decision making, with 7% went for demonstrating the benefits. So bringing in EJ and Joe, I just want to get your thoughts, starting with EJ, that, you know, one of the most important reasons to integrate wellbeing into net gain approaches is this aspect of true sustainable development. From, you know, from obviously your perspective and thinking about it from the academic viewpoint, but you work so closely with us in industry. What's your take on that being the driver, EJ?
I agree. And I also think that long-term success of biodiversity net gain is all interlinked with true sustainable development. And that, you know, if we don't get the social side right alongside the biodiversity side, then in the long term, the biodiversity side is going to suffer. So yeah, I'll pass over to Joe.
Yeah, I fully agree as well. I think it's interesting those two have come out as the kind of the key reasons, the most popular options, I should say. Absolutely agree about true sustainable development. And I think that's something that's been one of the key things that's hamstrung, you know, any places in which these kind of no net loss or net gain type approaches have been hamstrung in practice and in implementation. Almost always one of the key issues has been the fact that social considerations haven't been sufficiently integrated, and that's both as part of the long-term success of BNG, but also as EJ says, this point about ensuring true sustainable development. And you know, it's never really going to work unless this is done effectively, and that's something we've seen in a number of different parts of the world that be trying to implement these kind of policies.
So why is that though? And I'm interested to explore that. I think the two are so intricately linked, you know, true sustainable development and recognizing that the success of biodiversity net gain is actually dependent on thinking about the impacts that we have on people's well-being. You know, it's not about locking nature away. It's about making sure that we're doing net gain in ways that, you know, safeguard and ideally enhance people's well-being. Oh, we'll come on to the challenges in a moment, but Joe, from your experience thinking about internationally and thinking about what the UK can learn internationally, why is considering people essential for the long-term success of net gain?
Well, I think it's a relatively kind of bottom-up approach to kind of biodiversity impact mitigation, isn't it, really? Because what you're doing is you're relying upon a vast network of different stakeholders to play their part to ensure these things are successful, whether that's people actually ensuring that impacts are avoided, it's whether it's the people actually providing, you know, offsite biodiversity compensation sites, you know, whatever it might be. There's a lot of people involved, and it's a very bottom-up approach to biodiversity impact mitigation. Whereas, you know, you've got, as opposed to much more kind of top-down approaches, relatively top-down approaches to conservation, you know, like the creation and enforcement of protected areas or something like that. So I think because it's relatively bottom-up, it requires everyone to be sold on it. It requires everyone to be engaged and feel like they're integrated into those measures that are designed to ensure biodiversity net gain. And I think that's the reason why it's particularly important to consider everyone's priorities. I think also part of it is that by their very nature, you know, we all know these kind of these net outcome type approaches, such as biodiversity net gain, tend to be relatively controversial in some respects. You know, they tend to be, there's always certain stakeholder groups who aren't convinced about the you know, the justification of these type of approaches, and as such that they're really more than less controversial approaches. I think there is this need to incorporate and truly consider people's perspectives as widely as possible to kind of ensure that the concerns that people have are mitigated.
Okay. So coming to then, we're looking at the reasons why and the drivers. Let's think about the flip side then. In terms of the challenges, you know, we don't do this at the moment. We don't assess the impacts on people's wellbeing and development generally, let alone biodiversity net gain. And there are going to be challenges to do so. So while this is maybe the path ahead and thinking about that path as being true sustainable development, the more that we can think about the challenges and really unpack this, and the better armed we'll be to take those on. So we're going to go through these, and again ask you to vote on what you think are going to be the major challenges to this. So one of the ones that's come up from the discussion so far has been, well, hang on, if you think about people and well-being, it kind of takes over. So there is a challenge, I think, in terms of this balanced approach, and that will integrating well-being into biodiversity net gain lessen the true ambitions that we have to improve biodiversity through development, and risking that biodiversity net gain is compromised. You know, if you do this, I work with some brilliant ecologists, and, you know, knowing that their designs of net gain, are they just going to get trampled on by people walking their dog, or, you know, whatever that might be. So having that as a particular challenge, I think, is really important. And there's certainly that aspect of, well, look, you know, we've waited so long for net gain, finally we're here, can we just focus on biodiversity, because that's the important bit. There's also discussions about, well, hang on, this is already covered elsewhere. There's so much that we do consider about the social impacts of a development, and all of that is covered elsewhere. So, okay, it might not necessarily be specifically to well-being, but it's enough. You know, if we're thinking about the social impacts of development, that development includes net gain. So it's already covered by policies and regulations, and you're just adding something that we don't need to do. There's certainly an aspect about extra cost and time, you know, undertaking these wellbeing assessments. So, okay, there's advances in science. It's started to come through in practice. We've got the ONS survey. It's not perfect, so we would need that piece of work to really think about something that's going to be tailor-made for us in industry. But that does add maybe another layer for us. So is that an extra cost? That's just going to be an onerous burden, particularly for the small scale projects. Maybe it's just too difficult. You know, it's the subjective nature of well-being, and think about, well, how is this going to work in practice? It's difficult to assess well, and for those of us who, you know, go through that rigorous consent process, when you have to stand firm on the data that you've got and go through that, it might be a DCO consent or planning permission, whatever that might be, is it actually going to stand up, and can that be challenged? And then coming back to what Joe was saying earlier about, well, this is pretty specialist stuff, you know, that there's wellbeing assessments, it requires that specialist skills, but also that collaboration between biodiversity social experts, maybe this is fine for the, for the big projects, the ones that have resources and capabilities, but how realistic and how practical is that to actually happen on right across the board, even for the small projects? So again, these are some of the challenges. There might be others. So we're going to ask you to vote on your most important challenge that you think, but if there are others, then please do enter them into the chat function. So if we can run the second poll, thank you. So please vote on what you think is the most significant challenge to integrating wellbeing into the good practice principles. Okay, so we have the results. I'm hoping you can see them on your screen. So just it's fairly even actually, but just ahead, 33%, the lack of resources. I mean, already I think there's been so much discussion about how's net gain going to work when local planning authorities, don't have the ecological expertise that they have. So that's certainly an important consideration with 33% of lack of resources. But closely followed behind is this concern that it would lessen the biodiversity net gain ambition. If we suddenly open up net gain sites, giving people access to nature, would that actually compromise the ambitions that we have to improve biodiversity? 22% it's difficult to do, absolutely. And then we have the others, extra cost and already covered elsewhere. So, I mean, the lack of resources and certainly thinking about the wellbeing aspects and that collaboration piece is an important aspect. But thinking about lessening that biodiversity net gain ambition and how's this going to work in practice? So I think it's an interesting concept that immediately thinks, well, actually, is it either or? Is it biodiversity or well-being? And EJ, if I can bring you in here, what's that middle ground? Where can we get to when it's, and you talked about trade-offs before, how do we level that up where we do achieve the ambitions for nature, but also in ways that safeguard people's well-being?
I think we have to be very, very clear that biodiversity net gain is the fundamental requirement. So I think we have to make sure that ambition stays where it is, and then think about ways in which we can also make sure that people are left no worse off as part of the development. And there will be some overlap. When people were talking about existing services, there are win-wins where you can get both people benefiting from new nature and net gain being achieved. But there will be those trade-offs, and in those points where there's a trade-off, we have to make sure that net gain doesn't get watered down. So being very, very clear about that from the very beginning and right the way through the design is the important way, I think.
And I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think it's that point where it might not be one size fits all, and thinking about, well, it might be that we have a particular area for biodiversity, but then there's maybe something else closer to the development side that is more, if you like, socially orientated. Is those the kind of things that you can imagine being seen played out? We have a range of measures, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. And it may be that overall you get more nature, so you have to actually increase the biodiversity net gain ambition in order to include elements of biodiversity that are more appropriate for people. So it might actually work the other way if you think through the no worse off, as well as making sure that the net gain is a threshold that you can't go below. So I would see that you might be able to flip it to increasing the biodiversity net gain ambition.
And Joe, what's your stance and, and thinking about this collaboration piece? Let's come back to the lack of resources and that collaboration. And I know that that was such a current theme of the international principles and that collaboration. Is that something that you've come across a lot in your work?
Sorry, this issue of the lack of the resources, you mean?
Yeah, but also that collaboration piece. It was such a theme in the international principles. Thinking about this is, it relies heavily on that collaboration. I'm just wondering if that was, been a key theme that's emerged for your work.
Yeah, no, I think it has, and certainly in the projects that I would say have done relatively well, have one of the things they've done very effectively is ensure that level of collaboration and works across those different teams very effectively. So I think, yeah, that's certainly something I've seen in my work where I think it's been effective.
So let's come to now the certainly the questions that have been coming in, and just thinking about these aspects, and then I'll go through there's a few things that we can do now while this study is working on. But before we come to that, Izzy, could you read out a couple of the questions that are coming in?
Hiya, yeah. So we've had, I'd say, a few have been sort of addressing this question of how we do this. I think a really good one has been from an anonymous attendee, but it says, my difficulty is small scale sites and how to achieve this in a small backyard development of 1 or 2 houses. Is it realistic to apply the same standards across all scale sites?
So I think I work right across the board, from major projects to very small scale sites, and we definitely need a different approach, not just on the biodiversity net gain aspects, but also thinking about the social aspects as well. And, thinking about the biodiversity net gain, we're looking at the main menu, the main metric that has been produced. There is work being done on a small scale metric, and exactly the same, the principles are not prescriptive, they don't set how, they're the direction of travel. There's that piece about this is true sustainable development, and absolutely it's our job, if you like, to really think, well, how's this going to work equally well for a large scale projects, but equally on the small scale projects as well. And I mean, one aspect of the principle is engage stakeholders. So for small scale projects, that might simply be the business as usual. When you go through planning permission, you are engaging your local planning authority. So it's a question of saying, well, this is our net gain approach, and working with them on that basis. So it's not above and beyond, it's just something that you're working on. But yes, absolutely, it's taking those principles and adapting them to all industries, sizes and sectors.
Okay, would you like another one?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, and then we've also had a couple relating to sort of how do we make sure that that incorporating well-being doesn't sort of compromise biodiversity value. So this question says, by including well-being, how do we ensure that human well-being is not then prioritized over environmental well-being? And
I think, Kerry, this is something that we've discussed, and we've just sort of touched on it here. So it's such an important point, isn't it? If I can bring in Kerry and then EJ again. There's and I share this concern. We've been so long trying to get net gain, and finally it's here, and then it's like, well, is there going to be dog walkers going all over it? What's your take on that, Kerry, and certainly what's the experience internationally?
Hi, Julia. Yes, you've crystallized a really good question there, and I can see that several people are asking this. I think there's a number of aspects to it. The first is that what we're talking about really are potential trade-offs between the first issue, which will be mandatory in England, which is biodiversity net gain, and that the things we're discussing here make for better success and sustainable development and fairness, which is the social component on top. So what are the ways that we can avoid those trading off against each other? And one of them is to do a good job assessing the overall quality of the mitigation measures. So there's the famous mitigation myth. I'm sure we've all seen this on projects where things are set out as mitigation measures that on paper, in theory, look like they'll be fine. But we all know in practice that that nice area of land that's going to be restored for biodiversity net gain won't have any true function because all the cats of the people in the housing development are going to kill all the small mammals, etc. So I think part of it is to do with really rigorous and honest thinking about the likely outcome from the mitigation design you're planning and making sure that that's reflected in the metrics. And then I think you touched on something, Julia, that's a really good solution to part of the challenge that I've certainly seen used around the world. And that's not to assume that you're going to get all your wonderful bang for your buck, all your beautiful biodiversity net gain, ecology outcomes and the social outcomes on exactly the same plot of land, and to consider composite measures. So exactly as you said, to maybe ensure that the amenity, the access to nature, dog walking, all of those things can be done really up close and personal to people so that they're not losing what they probably had before, which is access to green space of some kind. But the things that we know are really important for connectivity and patch size and, you know, intrinsic ecological value, red listed species and everything, there's a little bit more spatial freedom for where to put those so that we get more bigger and better and joined up a la Lawton. So that probably needs maybe could need two places, if you like, and not the assumption that it's all able to be delivered in the one place.
And I think it kind of relates as well, doesn't it, to the starting point for biodiversity. You know, some of the projects that we're seeing come through for net gain are already on fairly low value land that, you know, looking at these little pockets, well, you know, what can we do for net gain in ways that people can also have access to nature that doesn't compromise it. And I think I certainly, you know, really value the nature reserves that I visit, you know, RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, where they do this really, really well. You know, you go around these places and they are just great in the way that they're kind of teeming with wildlife, and they're very careful in terms of where people can go and where they can't go. So is it, you know, that place of careful planning right up front?
I agree with you. I think it's the comprehensiveness and the sort of thoughtfulness of the planning in terms of feasible outcomes and spatially how it can be delivered that's really key. Another thing, just to link this into the earlier question about the scale, because, you know, if you're talking about a 600-mile linear project with loads of partners and loads of spatial freedom, it's easier to think about that. And I think people are struggling with the potential challenge of delivering that access to nature as well as the ecological values if it's something quite small like an urban housing development or whatever, and just the practicality of measuring it and whether the transaction costs will be very high for such small projects. And I can see that risk, and I think my experience with systems around the world is that as they mature, they become more nimble and fleet of foot, and they find quite practical ways of dealing with that. So one idea for the small scale would be to aggregate these things together and to try and really plan upfront a lot of green space sort of solutions, if you like, within local planning, within what's coming to us in the local nature recovery strategies and local planning authorities, and also through banking things together. And just in terms of transaction costs, it's interesting to see in some places that over time, some of the very small systems, instead of having to deal with units, have kind of moved over to over-the-counter things where somebody else, whether it's an NGO or local authorities, take on that aggregated delivery of local needs for green space, etc., as part of offsets. And the developer doing their, you know, small single house on an old plot can just buy units sort of over the counter. So I think there are ways to make it work.
Absolutely. Izzy, any other questions that are coming through?
Yes, so we've had a couple sort of looking at whether so I'll just read out this one here as it summarizes it quite well. They say, perhaps I'm missing something, that won't well-being be considered alongside other ecosystem services in an environmental net gain or natural capital assessment?
Yeah, so this is really good one. So EJ, just coming to you. So I suppose this is the difference between what you were saying about allowing people to express what they feel. So ecosystem service assessments, natural capital, I suppose they'll capture the material aspects of what people have, but is the well-being that extra layer in terms of how people feel about what they have and what they can do with what they have?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I'd say that the ecosystem services are the things that will lead to a change in well-being, or change in the ecosystem services, or a change in natural capital will lead to changes in well-being. But the well-being is the thing that the individual has. And so I think ecosystem services and natural capital potentially could influence all three elements of well-being, which is the material, the relational, and the subjective. But they don't entirely encompass it. So you might think, for example, that you know, an area has an enhanced ecosystem service, even in terms of recreational value, for example. But what really matters is who's gaining and who's losing, and how they're actually able to access and use that. So the kind of there's quite a major difference there. And I think Kerry wanted to say something as well.
Well, yes, I agree with you, EJ, but it's very interesting to think about it because obviously what we need to do is kind of account for the different values that people are generating, whether that's well-being, whether it's a different type of ecosystem service, whether it's the intrinsic biodiversity that we're trying to measure through biodiversity net gain. So part of the question is, what is the framing and how are we accounting for it? And I do think there's a value for natural capital accounts. Tends to be done obviously in economic terms, but there are rather good methods for valuation of a number of ecosystem services, whether it's kind of you know, carbon sequestration or air pollution or even recreational values. You know, I think it's not beyond the bounds of people's possibility to draw on some methods that are in the Green Book and so on for putting these on the face of an account. And early approaches have been tried. Julie and I worked on one together for a large infrastructure project to be able to show biodiversity net gain in biodiversity units, so in biophysical measures, not in pounds, shillings and pence, on the face of a balance sheet alongside valuation for some of the other ecosystem services. So I do think that there are already tools that can put these things together, and I think it depends a little bit on the scope of somebody's exercise and what their motivation is as to the most sort of straightforward way for them to deal with it.
Great. Izzy, we'll try and get 2 more questions in depending on time. One more, so let's start off with one question.
Okay, yeah, sure. So this is from Louise Mapston, and she said, do we need a blended approach, i.e. sometimes well-being impacts can be integrated with BNG sites, but other sites might require exclusion, fencing from dog waters, etc., to ensure that sites achieve appropriate habitat condition. So sometimes it may be in those circumstances, other wellbeing offsets might be required, so e.g. by providing better quality amenity space elsewhere. So I guess this is about sort of equivalency in how you compensate for people's well-being.
Yeah, I think that's such a lovely way of putting it, actually. You know, the recognizing where you might have one site, that's great. You know, you get your net gains and people get access to nature, or even views of nature. Views of nature are equally important. Or there might be some situations where there's heavy people use and it's just, you won't get the biodiversity net gain ambitions that you want to do. So thinking about that multifunctional landscape, and again, it has to be practical. It has to relate to the size and the scale and the nature of your development, but also its impact on biodiversity in the first place. So I think that's a really great way of putting it and thinking about, well, is this going to be a situation where we have different approaches for net gain, but also something specific for people's access to nature, or could we get one site with everything? Okay, and let's try one more question before we have to sign off.
Sure. Okay. This is quite a big one. So from Tim Sexton asks, and this is relating to sort of the how again. When is Wellbeing Metric, the Wellbeing Metric, likely to become mandated? Is it being practiced already? And what is the roadmap for its consideration?
Oh, that's a great question. So it kind of comes back to this scoping study is simply asking a question. We're reviewing the good practice principles for the moment. And we know that there's progress been made on the biodiversity aspects, but we are focusing specifically on the social aspects of our UK good practice principles. We know that there's international calls to consider and actually measure the impact of net gain on people's well-being. So at the moment, it's grassroots. It's exactly where we started with net gain, which was owned and discussed and considered by industry. Then yes, brilliantly, we now have policy, and in England, the Environment Bill catching up, but this is firmly rooted in our industry good practice principles. So part of this work is really understanding what policy and regulatory drivers already exist. But this is about our industry and thinking about what does our good look like for us all to work on that. So on that basis, and thank you all so much, I know that we've had a lot of other questions coming in. We will certainly take them and include them in our study, but just to leave you with a couple of things coming in. So really quickly, if you're interested in this work, there is loads of things that you can do at the moment. There's a green space index. If you just Google it, it's open access data. You could use that to look at what access people have to green space at the moment, and you can use that as part of your net gain assessment. There's the Access to Nature Standards, the ANCS by Natural England, that's been published a while ago, and they're still relevant and useful. Multiple deprivation industries, they are published, again, open access data. You can take it and you can map your net gain projects based on that. For those of you working in larger sites, probably every local planning authority has a local health and wellbeing board. You know, as well as engaging your local planning authority ecologist, think about engaging your local health and wellbeing boards. There might be those situations where we can get the win-wins. I've seen some fantastic designs of SUDs coming through lately that have that interaction between the benefit for biodiversity and giving people, you know, an enriched natural environment. But just coming back to that question, I think it's going to be a sense check of, well, actually, this is for biodiversity here, and we have to know when different measures are necessary. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time this morning. There is an online survey. It will be live this week. We will send you a link. Please, please be part of this discussion, be part of this call, for part of the review for our net gain process. We are relying on your feedback to really help navigate through this question. So please share it, please fill it in. We'll also be releasing a call for case studies. So if you're involved in any social aspects of net gain or even well-being, please be in touch. This study as well for us, we're hosting interviews and literature reviews. We'll publish the report early 2021, and we will be coming back with a webinar of our findings back in 2021 again. So please keep a watch out for the date. I'll certainly be posting about it. But if you're really interested and want to know more, please be in touch. But thank you so much, everyone, for your time. My big thanks to our panel members, Kerry, EJ, Joe, and Izzy. And with that, we will say thank you very much, everyone.